So today I'm here to talk about science fiction and fantasy books, including one series that was absolutely perfect, or at least it would have been if it wasn't so incredibly flawed. I have such mixed feelings about some of the books on this list. I can't wait to tell you all about them and attempt to recommend them to the right audience. Let's get started. All right, let's start by talking about some of the science fiction I read this week because I feel like that's a little bit easier to talk about. The first one is this book here, Devil's Gun by Cat Rambo. This is a sequel book in a cozy space opera series where we follow a group of ex-military employees who go off to form a restaurant. That is in the first book, which is You Sexy Thing, and then this is the follow-up. Technically, you could start here. I don't really feel like it spoils the events of the last book, or at least there is a beginning where it catches you up to what's happened so far. But honestly, I really like the first one, so I recommend going back to the beginning. This is a book that I'd recommend for those of you that love the Wayfarer series by Beckers Chambers, or perhaps are looking for something like Legends and Lattes and what it does for fantasy. If you're looking for a cozy, again, space opera book, this is the one I would recommend. I actually like it a touch more than the Wayfarer series just because while I like A Long Way to the Small Angry Planet to a degree, I find that it lacked a lot of plot. And that's where I really like this one, is that it's the adorable idea of, well, what if you have a bunch of like people going and making a restaurant in space, and so you get to deal with alien food and all of that. But then there actually is a plot going on within the story, and things happen, and there's just actually movement in the plot, which is something I personally need as a little bit of narrative drive along the way typically. So this is one I really do enjoy. I mentioned that when it comes to my all-time favorite books, I tend to prefer something a little bit darker and grittier. So this may not end up on my favorites of the year, but would I recommend it if you're looking for something that is comforting, a feel-good read? Absolutely, I think this really hits the spot. Next, let me attempt to review Quicksilver by Neal Stephenson. This is a story that is set in the Baroque era of Europe, and so we follow this character of Daniel in this Puritan period where he is trying to go out and look at the world in a new light, seeking the help of some of the great thinkers of this time. So this is a piece of historical fiction that has crossover with science fiction, which is the author's primary genre that they write in. And if you don't know, I'm a huge fan of Neal Stephenson's work. I am working towards doing a video of where to start with his work, recommendations, all of that, but obviously I need to read everything first, and this has been one of his most intimidating series. It's the first book in the Baroque cycle, which I do plan on continuing based off of this, and this is a book that is incredibly dense. It definitely would benefit you as a reader if you have a bit of knowledge of that time period. Particularly, this book has a focus on this period of time in this Puritan era where there is a conflict between religious beliefs and scientific beliefs and trying to marry them together, and just the back and forth within here. This book interweaves, as I mentioned, main popular and well-known historical figures within the time period, and we follow the characters that are going through all this. I love this book, but I also was very lost in certain points of time. I will give myself that disclaimer. The fact is that there's a lot going on in this book that I'm just not as familiar with that time period as I would like to be. Again, I love books like this because when I see those gaps in my knowledge, it really compels me to go out and learn that. And so I'm definitely, as I'm recording this, have been in the process of trying to learn more about that time period and about some of the references and characters that are mentioned within the story. And so again, an author can make me go out of my way to spend my free time learning something educational. I think that they have done their job. And that's basically what Neal Stephenson does every time that he writes a book, at least in my experience. So I really enjoyed this one. If you are new to Neal Stephenson or new to science fiction, this is not where I'd recommend starting. I probably would recommend reading this book as one of his last compared to a lot of the other books I've read so far by him. This one is not very accessible. It most closely reminds me of Anathema, which I also think is a book that is a little bit less accessible, and I would still recommend reading that one first because that one still seemed a lot easier to follow than this one. As I mentioned, it's the first book in a series, and I've heard things that the series gets better from here. I've heard that it goes downhill. I will find out for myself, but I am completely in it. I just think that Neal Stephenson is such a brilliant writer, and I just want more. If you ever have recommendations for other authors like him that you don't think I'm already reading, please let me know. I'm always looking for a read-alike because I'm slowly coming to terms with the fact that I'm getting closer to reading through all of his collection, or at least his main work, and that's going to be a really sad day when I've read everything. So hopefully he keeps writing more books in the future. Highly recommend this one to the right audience. It's not the place to start with this work. It's not the place to start with science fiction, but it's a great place to end up. Now let's switch over to fantasy, starting with Age of Ash by Daniel Abrams. This is an epic fantasy story that is the start of, I believe is going to be a new trilogy. The second book has come out in July, but I haven't received a review copy of that yet. I'm hoping it's coming because I really enjoyed this one. This follows a petty thief, a street rat in this city here. At the beginning of the story, her brother is murdered. It's on the back of the book. It's not a spoiler. And that sets him off to, of course, find out what happened and spirals them into something larger. This is the book that I went into honestly very blind. I did not even read the back of the book when I first picked it up because I knew this is a book I wanted to check out. I really enjoyed it for several reasons. One being the fact that I'm learning I enjoy urban fantasy, not specifically what we classify as urban fantasy, but epic fantasy that is set in a secondary urban setting. And so books like this really appealed to me. I found the world, or specifically the city, to be very lush. It felt real and gritty and very much a place. And I love our main character within there. This, again, street rat. It felt very relatable, a character who is easy to root for and very sympathetic in nature with the setup of the story. As for the mystery itself, I found it compelling. I kept reading. There's lots going on. As I mentioned, this is the first book in a series, but I do feel like it works pretty well as just a standalone book. But at the same time, I really would love to read more in this world. This is the same author who is half of the duo who does the Expanse series, or did the Expanse. I guess that's mostly done now. But I would say that while I love the Expanse, I would not particularly recommend this book simply because you love the Expanse series, because while I knew it was the same author, the writing style, the story, the plot, all of that really didn't ring as familiar in any way. So if you're looking for those Expanse vibes, I didn't see any similarities there. Instead, I suspect this is much more reminiscent of their fantasy work, which I definitely want to check out their backlist now because I really enjoyed this. I thought the prose were great, the characters, the world building, all of that. I definitely want more, and I can see why people recommend him as a standalone author because this was really great. Next, let's talk about City of Bones by Martha Wells. This is a book that is a re-release. It's an epic fantasy that she wrote well before Murderbot, and it's just, again, getting a new life now that they are a more well-known author. And so this is a book that is set in this desert world where there is this humanoid race that has been created to survive in the desert. You find out that there are these ancients who essentially appear to have built everything, and now there are those that are seeking out to find the relics of this society. So I love that while this is fantasy, it actually has a bit of a science fiction type angle to it, that perhaps regress society, there's something more. And so those pieces I found so fascinating as a concept. I really enjoyed a lot of the aspects here. This is a book that I enjoyed a lot more than Witch King, which I previously reviewed on my channel. That's their new release, which honestly I didn't find to be that compelling compared to something like this, which I thought was much closer aligned to something like Murderbot. That being said, for a premise that is that cool, the story still felt very, very standard if you didn't know a lot of the outside world building that is happening. If you just read the story without consideration for the larger scope, I found like you almost could not know that it had those other aspects and you just read like a really traditional fantasy story. I like this one. I just wish that it had pushed a little bit more in terms of boundaries and kind of explored more of the ancients, done a lot, I don't know, it could have done a little bit more than it was doing. I felt like it was as ambitious as it could have been. So I like this one. I just wish the author had pushed it a little bit further. I do wonder if they were to write this book again today after doing something again as creative as Murderbot, I feel like they would have gone to some greater heights. And again, maybe it comes down to my expectations, wanting them to do something a little bit more out of the box because I like this one, but I've seen these tropes before and it stayed a little too predictable for something that sounded oh so creative from the premise. Next, we have After the Forest by Kell Woods, and this is a fairy tale retelling, or rather specifically focusing on what happens after the fairy tale ends. So within this one, it focuses on the story of Hansel and Gretel, and we follow them 15 years later after the witch's house. And as adults, you could say that they aren't well functioning, they are struggling and just not doing okay. In terms of a premise, I love this. It definitely reminds me of Sean McGuire's series. I think that it really appeals to those ideas of, well, what happens after the fairy tale is done. I think it's a great exploration. I love to see it done. But in comparison to Every Hearted Doorway and Sean McGuire's series, I felt like this one really lacked. I didn't find myself as attached to the characters, and for an idea that has such great potential around it, again, I feel like the author didn't really expand the idea as much as I would have liked and kind of made a small story that didn't have as much underlying commentary and nuance as I would have liked. So I'll be honest, this one didn't work really well for me. I love fairy tale retellings. I think it's so smart. I think it's a great idea, but in execution, I was a little bit let down. I didn't have the best time with this one. And let's switch gears and talk about some backlist fantasy. Finally, I'm ready to discuss the series that would have been absolutely perfect if it wasn't so incredibly flawed. And that is The Magician's Trilogy. I'm going to hold up the first book, but I've read all three books, The Magician's King, and then The Magician's Land. You definitely need to read the series as a whole in order to really understand it. I talked about the series before because I hauled these recently. And so this is a series that I read the first book many years ago, didn't really understand, thought it was just supposed to be a redo of Harry Potter. And when it turned out to be something very different, I was disappointed. So I wanted to revisit the series again now that I have a better understanding of what the author was trying to do. And I really love what the author is trying to do. I just don't know if he did it that well. Let me attempt to explain in a spoiler-free way. So if you don't know, this is a book that follows a man named Quentin. He grew up loving this fantasy series that is known as Fillory. And that essentially is a copycat of something you would know as Narnia. And so he obsessively read the books growing up and really wanted that world to be real. You find out that he's someone who doesn't entirely fit in social culture. He likes a girl who likes someone else. He is socially awkward and just has that personality, or is in a space where you see that he wants to escape. He wants to go somewhere else. He deals with depression. And he, at the beginning, really thinks, well, everything would just be perfect. If Fillory was real, if he could go somewhere else, everything around him would work itself out. His problems would be solved. And then right at the beginning of the story, this is all in the setup in the first few chapters, he finds out that perhaps magic is real. He's going to apply for university and ends up getting pulled into these exams for this magic school. He ends up passing, and then the story goes from there as he attempts to learn magic within the school. He follows his new friends, and of course the story goes from there. I think the premise of this one is brilliant. I think so often, especially as fantasy readers, we read this genre for escapism, and so the author really leans into that and says, okay, you want to escape into a fantasy world, let's see if magic is as perfect as you think it is. And so instead of showing this magical world, instead this author brings in the reality of, well, what if magic exists but people are still terrible? What if people are still evil and selfish and everything else that humanity is still exists, but we just happen to have magic and it doesn't actually fix our problems? So you see the character as he's dealing with more problems, new problems, and just the fact that magic changes his problems, but it doesn't make it go away. Again, a brilliant idea. I love the setup so much. The main character, as you can probably guess from some of the synopsis I'm talking about, is not the most likable. He makes a lot of poor choices because he's very antisocial. He doesn't really get along with people, and he's broody and whiny, and again, a lot of things that make sense for someone who is depressed but doesn't make for the most fun reading experience. I knew that and was more prepared rereading this first book the first time. However, my complaint with this book really comes down to the narrative structure, and there's two main points I'm going to make here. So the first one is the overall narrative structure in terms of the positioning of the plot. So within this first book, I'm not going to spoil it, but there is a major shift in the story, and it's just very jarring. I understand why it's done, but even rereading it the second time when I knew it was coming, I still found it to be a very sharp twist. And even within the first part of the story, there is this one chapter where there is this major event that happens within a classroom, and the pacing of that, the descriptions of that, is just odd. And I think it's supposed to create a feeling of suspense or dread, and I've read it multiple times now, and it just never lands right. I can never tell what the author was actually trying to do with that scene. And so I just find myself unsatisfied with a lot of this story. And then moving on to the second book, Magician's King, we find out what happened to one of the side characters. And my frustration is that those scenes, those descriptions, that information should have been given to the reader in book one. This side character, at least in the main books, is virtually forgotten in book one. You see them a few times, and then they become a major player in book two, and the author has to catch you up on everything that happened to them. And it just makes for a very fragmented storytelling. I'm going to get to the TV show in a moment here, because basically what the TV show did is remix these plot lines and put them into more of a sequential order that makes so much more sense. I've only watched the pilot of the TV show, but I had a friend who explained the order to me and I kind of looked it up online. And in terms of the narrative plot, The author just made certain events happen in a very strange order. My other main complaint with this series is the fact that we are often told information that would be so much more interesting to actually get to see as it's happening. So as I mentioned, we have this side character who has this horrific thing that has happened to them, and that takes place in the first book. So not only are we not told that information when it's happening, but we're mostly told the information through a third-person ominous narration, and I think that that's very traditional for fantasy, which is probably why they made that narrative choice. But the problem with that is that we are just told so-and-so was depressed, so-and-so wasn't happy, so-and-so would never love again type of language, and I wanted to actually see their character development and growth and pain and struggles as it was happening, and getting to see it in a more intimate way rather than being told he's depressed, she's upset. And I would just have liked to see it in a more natural way. So I did not love that style of writing. I actually thought there was a lot of interesting information that was being conveyed to the reader, but the manner in which they were doing it was just so dry and distancing ourselves from the characters that it really made it harder for me to care emotionally for them, which is really where I struggle when it comes to book 3. As for the final book, I feel like it was fairly good. I was fairly happy with the ending, but my main complaint of that one is just that the build and the setup and the finale never felt earned because all the pieces never really fit together. It's a book, again, with an amazing premise, amazing setup, but it's so imperfect, which is so frustrating because if it wasn't so flawed, it could easily be one of my all-time favorite series. If it had been done differently, as I understand the TV show with actually being, again, remixed how it deals with events and storytelling and so forth, I could really love this. And it's so hard when an author just gets in their own way. Needless to say, it's a really hard book to recommend, but I do want to cautiously recommend it to those that are interested in this book. It's kind of one in a series that you need to try out for yourself. I do think that the ideas presented are brilliant. The social commentary surrounding education, and particularly public education, is great because you have a school that is elite, that they do not let everyone in. And within the story, you get to see what happens in a society where you only teach and train and educate those that you deem to be worthy, and what happens to the rest when they are pushed out into society without those structures in place. So in terms of those ideas, I thought it was brilliant. I just think that the story, again, got in its own way. Can I say that enough? And oh man, this one should have been perfect. I'm so disappointed. I still liked it. I gave it 3.5 stars for the most part. But yeah, it had perfect potential and fell a little bit shy of that. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? If you've read the Magician's Trilogy, I would love to hear more of your thoughts down below, whether you agree or disagree. I just love to have the conversation. And I'd also love to hear, is there a series, a book that you read that would have been perfect if it wasn't so flawed? So one of those books that had so much potential and then just kind of dropped the ball and missed the mark. I would love to hear your picks down below. If you're new to my channel and want to stick around, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things. If you want to help me out with this video, I appreciate a thumbs up, dropping a comment, even if just a little emoji like a book stack, that always works. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.